we have with us three of the lions in our company, in the anti-Semitism family. It's Professor Elchanan Yakira, Professor Alvin Rosenfeld, and Professor Erwin Kotler. So we are hoping for a very interesting session. There will be time for discussion. Each of the panelists is warned to speak no more than 25 minutes so that we do have some time. And I'd like to start by introducing to you, whomever doesn't know him yet, Professor Elchanan Yakira. Oh, Boker Tov. Okay. Professor in the Department of Philosophy of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, received his PhD in philosophy at Paris Sorbonne. His main fields of interest and work have been early modern philosophy and, in more recent years, 20th century phenomenology, French thought in the 20th century, and political philosophy. But what do they, out of all his work, what do they come up with? Among his scholarly books and articles is Post-Zionism, Post-Shoah, 3 essays on denial, repression, and delegitimation of Israel. 2010, this is how we came to know you in this field. Yeah, and we welcomed him into the field as a fresh new start. He taught and was a visiting scholar in many institutions in Europe and in the United States, more recently at Indiana University Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, the head of which is sitting, Professor Alvin Rosenfeld, just next to him. His latest work is Spinoza, Cambridge University Press, forthcoming. And the topic of his talk is quite intriguing: the wicked son towards a phenomenology of betrayal. So let's see what would we have. Sorry.
Thank you. You hear me? Yeah. It's okay? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Dina, first of all, and thank you, Robert, for inviting me to this nice conference. Actually, I would like to change the title of my paper. Instead of The Wicked Son, I would like to put there on treacherousness or something like this. In Hebrew, it's Bogdanut. And I have to thank Alvin Rosenfeld who drew my attention to the fact, which I actually knew but forgot, that there is a book, sorry, a book bearing the same title, David Mamet, The Wicked Son, of course. I think we thought more or less of the same thing, but the title is already occupied. But the subject is more or less the same. Although I shall have different things to say than David Mamet, of course, but thank you, Alvin, to draw my attention to it. The wicked son, or the second son of the Haggadah, you know, I'm sure the story. I think, like many others, that the Haggadah is very, what it says about the wicked son is interesting in many ways, but as I shall try to show, is not the whole story, only part of it, at least insofar as our times is concerned. Sorry. I want to say, we know all about what we are going to talk, I think. This is what we used to call post-Zionism. I think a better name and more accurate would be terms that we have already heard here, like anti-Zionism, anti-Israelism, and the rest of it. Post-Zionism is a more vague term. Even Ben-Gurion described himself as a post-Zionist, and I think he was right in this. And I would say that in many ways I am too post-Zionist. But the anti-Zionism and anti-Israelism is another thing. Now, I'm not going to talk, of course, about anti-Israelism in general. I'm going to talk about something which is part of it, and it is the participation of Israelis in these campaigns or movement of anti-Zionism. Not Jews in general. I want to talk about Israelis, about Israel. And in many ways, this is, I think, a specific phenomenon for many reasons. But I want to begin with saying what it is not. Usually, very often, David Mamet did it as well, talked about this phenomenon in terms of self-hatred. And the first thing I want to say, this is not self-hatred. And very often it's not hatred at all. The second thing I want to say to begin with is that someone yesterday asked a question about the victory of the kind of struggles some of us, or all of us actually, conduct against anti-Semitism in general. And so I think that in general we don't see much success in our efforts or to oppose anti-Semitism, anti-Israelism. In Israel, I think there is a victory. I wrote the book that was mentioned here before. In Israel, at the beginning of the 2003-4, it came out in 2006, the same year that David Mamet's came out, by the way, when there was a feeling that there was a real, my feeling was, and many others, there was a real ideological struggle in Israel. I think that this struggle has been won, basically. The group of people I wrote about, so-called post-Zionists, my feeling is, I'm not a sociologist, so I have to be cautious here, but my feeling is that these people, or this kind of ideology, has been marginalized in Israel. Most of the people I wrote about in my book either left Israel, or I hear some gossip here and there, are about to leave Israel. They, anyway, talk, all of them, outside. They don't talk to us anymore, almost. And they're, I think that the influence or the impact on the Israeli society is marginal. I'll give you a few indications. What so-called anti-Zionist, generally speaking, it's a very vague and inaccurate term, but let's say the left-wing anti-Zionist don't have even one single representative in the Knesset. The left-wing, even I think the communist, the only Jewish communist representative it wouldn't be justifiably called anti-Zionist. He's very critical, very left-wing, but he's not really anti-Zionist. I don't think so. And if he is the only one. Of course, there are some Arab representatives in the Knesset that can be, that have some kind or another of an ideology or conception or political stance that can be described as anti-Zionist. But we are not talking about them. On the other hand, there are Jewish representatives in the Knesset who are anti-Zionist, either Orthodox or right-wing religious representative. They are anti-Zionist in many ways, and in certain ways more dangerous than the one I'm talking about. But we are not talking about because they are not part of the anti-Semite tradition, but they are all the same anti-Zionists in the sense that they don't accept the authority of Jewish sovereignty in many ways. And, but I won't talk about them. But I think that if you are talking about anti-Zionism in the sense that we usually talk about it in the connection of more left-wing, generally speaking, tendencies. In Israel, they've become marginalized. But they exist, of course. And I would mention here 2 or 3 examples that through them I would try to understand the phenomenon. In the very many discussions that were held here in Israel, not so much or almost not at all outside of Israel, the book was translated and appeared in English and French, but it was more or less ignored. But in Israel, it was the cause for many discussions. Some of them were interesting and some of them very intense. There were a few questions that were often raised. How come? How to explain it? And how bad it is? And what to do? And I'm not going to ask the question, how come, where does it come from, what are the reasons? I don't want to explain this phenomenon. And what to do about it, there's very little we can do about it. I think what happened here in Israel, insofar as I am concerned, and as far as I can see accurately what happened in the marginalization, it just happened. And there was a discussion, this still goes on, and this is the result of it. How bad it is? I don't know. One of the things that many people asked me when I started doing this kind of work was, don't you have, like Alvin Kotler yesterday asked, anti-Semitism again? So I heard the same questions many times. Don't you have anything better to do than this? And sometimes I feel this question is a good question, actually. I'll give you an example. One of the people I want to talk about here is Shlomo Zand. He is a specimen, I think, a paradigm of the phenomenon I want to talk about. His book here had for a time been read. It was even high on the list of bestsellers. I doubt if there are very many people who take it seriously. And here in Israel, it had a huge success in France mainly. It was translated into some 20 languages, I think, and mainly in France. I'll come back to it if I have time in a moment. Anyway, last week I received a very interesting book written by Professor Claude Klein. Just came out in France against Shlomo Zand. And so happened that the next day I was somewhere else and we were discussing it, and there was a guy there who read the book. It's an Israeli pilot. He's not anymore, but used to fly until the age of 50, as it is done here in the reservist. And he read the book. And we were discussing it, and he said, it's a very interesting book, and I tried to understand why it is interesting and convinced him that it is not so interesting, actually. And if it is, and we agreed about this, it is interesting in the way pornography is interesting, for instance. So but he more or less agreed with me, but not But the discussion was quite short, ended by him saying, you know, but who cares? Who cares? And if he's right in everything that he says, that we are actually descendants of the Khazars, and that Yiddish is not Yiddish but actually Turkish, and that kind of Turkish, the Hebrew is not Hebrew but Yiddish, and all the other things that he says there. So if it is true, so what? Who cares? He's right. Who cares? People cares outside. So this is one of the. We have more important things to do, and I think this is a part of what I want to say about this phenomenon. I want to say another thing. One of the terms, the notions that come to the fore, obviously and often when this question is asked, is the notion of self-hate. These people, David Mamet makes the immediate connection between this, the wicked son and self-hate. And I want to say this is not self-hate, what we are talking about here. And I want to give you just another story, another example, and draw through it to, first of all, one distinction. But let me first tell you the story. A few years ago, in the late 70s, there was a case, very famous case of real treason, high treason here, the Udi Adif famous case, and a few people were caught, brought to justice, tried, and served many years in jail, actually. I knew very well one of them. I knew him as a soldier. He was the best soldier I've ever known. The most reliable, honest, nice, courageous. Everything you can say of the good sides of soldier, he was one of them. He didn't hate. There was no hatred in him, but there was a lot of ideology. He came from the Shomer HaTzair, and actually from the more even left to the Shomer HaTzair, and he was caught in this story and became involved in it, and then was caught and served some time in jail too. He doesn't hate, not himself, certainly not, and I don't think he hates Israel or us, his friends. So this is not about hatred. And I think that what the phenomenon of Israeli anti-Zionism is not about hatred. Some of them may be, but basically it's not. I would go one step further and I say that the notion of hatred is not applicable, not only inapplicable here, but also not very interesting. Hatred or hate is an affect. And I think that everybody has affects, and in certain cases, in certain points in periods in history, this was maybe a typical or characteristic psychopathology. Yes or no, it's not interesting, I would say. And I would put it this way. One of the notions that come, I think, immediately to mind, come anyway to my mind, is, of course, the opposite, the seemingly opposite notion, the one of Ahavat Israel. Ahavat Israel famously was mentioned or came by Gershom Scholem in his very famous letter to Hannah Arendt, and I won't go back to the story, but what comes out from the discussion between them is that this is the Ahavat Israel in the sense that Scholem meant it, and that Hannah Arendt pretends not to understand it, is a political term, is not a psychological one. And I think the whole question has to be taken and understood and analyzed in terms of as a political phenomenon and not as a psychological one. This is what I'm trying to say. So one of the things that I want to say is it's not about hatred. And in any case, hatred is not the right terms to analyze it. the other thing that I would like to mention here is that it's also using these terms like self-hatred and even anti-Semitism, Jewish anti-Semitism, etc., is not only inaccurate, but also counterproductive. One of the things that happen, I think, to me anyway, when I deal with these things, not only as an historian, monitoring, etc., but trying to not only understand, but somehow contribute to the kind of ideological struggles that we have here on Zionism, etc., is that I always feel that we are one step behind. We always fight the yesterday's war. I'll give you an example. A book just came out a few months ago, edited by one of the most famous European philosophers, Gianni Vattimo. I don't know if you heard the name, but he's very famous among philosophers, among so-called postmodern philosophers. He's also a deputy in the European Parliament. And he just came out with a book. There's a co-editor. I never heard of it. I don't remember the name. The title of the book is Deconstructing Zionism. And Deconstructing Zionism, it's unbelievable, amazing in many, very many ways. I just began reading it. I didn't have time to finish it yet. But there is, for instance, some very famous people contributed to it, like Judith Butler and Slavoj Žižek, for instance, also very famous kind of star philosopher, very media-oriented philosopher, but famous and well-read, appreciated, translated, you name it. And he wrote an article in which he, in a very typical way, reversed the thing. He is, of course, anti-Semite. All of them are. I mean, there's no anti-Semite, no one, not only openly says that he or advances any anti-Semite views, but they are openly, explicitly anti-Semite. And one of the things is that either they accuse Zionism of using this accusation of anti-Semitism against them, and they become victims immediately of this baseless accusation. And what Zizek says, he goes even further, and he tries to show how Zionism is actually the real contemporary anti-Semitism. For a reason I won't get into, but this is, it's all, as we say in Hebrew, hafuch al hafuch al hafuch al hafuch. Everything it turns upside down, everything is reversed, and what we try to attribute to them turns immediately against us in one way or another, and we eventually, whatever we do, whatever we say, we find ourselves on the Safsal HaNe'eshamim, on the defense, exactly. So, but I looked through the index of this book, and there are few names, a few Israeli names, very few Israeli names. One of them is Ilan Pappé. Ilan Pappé, I'm sure you know him. I have to tell you a short anecdote. Ilan Pappé, well, you know, I don't have to tell you who he is actually. Yeah, he was here. He's one of those who left. Someone told me that he attended a lecture he gave, I think it was Cambridge or Oxford, I don't know, in the group which is not known of specialists, of Mid-Eastern specialists, who are not known for their great sympathy for Israel. And an Israeli guy who was there too, he didn't say anything. He told me, and after the lecture by Ilan Pappé, one of the people who were there, one of his colleagues from this Department of Middle Eastern Studies, turned to him and he said, "This is you, Lord How How." Lord How How, Lord How How, Ho Ho, sorry. I think that, so Ilan Pappé didn't make any crime. He's not, he's not like this friend of mine that was committed high treason. He didn't. And he is perfectly within the limits of the law. And still, we would like to, and we often do, and I think it's true, that there is something about what he does, about what he represents, that justifies that we talk about him in terms of betrayal. What is why is it a betrayal? Again, I want to emphasize once again, I'm not talking about his frame of mind or the psychological reasons or causes or whatever from which it comes. Another anecdote, after my Hebrew book was published, I received many letters and reactions. One of them was from someone who comes from the far left parts of Israeli society, and he's a psychologist too, and he wrote to me that after the failure of the Camp David talks, many of his friends moved even more to the left, and he became anti-Zionist in one or another, and he was curious to know what happened, so he made some kind of research on them, and he found out that significantly, those people had the problem with their fathers. So maybe it's true or not, but it's not interesting. This is what I'm trying to say. I have to finish, okay. Okay, so what about Ilan Pappé? What makes him a good candidate to fall under the category of betrayal? I would say this. The Haggadik story speaks about הוציא את עצמו מן הכלל, right? So he did it. But he went further. Many people מוציאים עצמם מן הכלל, draw themselves out of the community today. There are many people, we call them in Israel Yordim, and there are many Jews in all over the world who draw themselves out of the community, of the klal. And we can like it or not, but there is not something that I think which is reproachable on a moral basis. But here there is something else. He didn't only took himself out, but he is actively talking and working against us, against Israel in this case. But still this is not enough. He did something more. Many people work and talk against us. All of us actually do it in one way or another. But he did something more, and I think this is the main point, is that he completely assumes and embraces the point of view of the enemies of Israel. Ilan Pappé said it many times explicitly, so there's no interpretation here. He speaks in the name of the Palestinians' narrative. What is called, he calls it narrative, it's a very popular word now. So he is here to advance the case of the Palestinians from the point of view of the narrative, not only because he thinks they were wronged in this way or another and they deserve a state, many of us do think the same, but he accepts completely the whole First of all, okay, I think this is enough. I'll finish it.
Thank you so much, Professor Yakira. Well, this is, of course, a topic on our plates, and you touched many pertinent points. Let me just add that perhaps the impact in Israel has been marginalized, certainly during the last years and in proportion to other things that are happening in the Middle East. And but there was a lot of damage done abroad, sure. That's for sure. Zand has done a lot of damage, that's also. And one more point is that you were speaking about the families. I think that if you make a list of them and you look at them, most of them, the post-Zionists, come from either they have a problem with their fathers, they said. If the fathers were communist, Bundists, and of Yeke origin. Because these are, no, this is not funny. These are the groups that have not integrated as, let's say, Eastern Jews who came. Okay, Jüdische, das ist ein anderer Meister. Okay. So, we leave it to the discussion. Yeah. The second in line here is Professor Alvin Rosenfeld, who will be talking about another intriguing issue, and this is what exactly is criticism of Israel. And our friend Alvin Rosenfeld has taught at Indiana University since 1968. That was long ago. He holds the Irving M. Glazer Chair in Jewish Studies and is director of the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. Some of you who are sitting here participated in the conference, the conference that he had organized just recently. He founded Indiana University Bourne's Jewish Studies program, served as its director for 30 years. Among his works, I will not read the whole line, but there are many. The impact of Elie Wiesel, reflections on Holocaust literature, imagining Hitler, and now a most recent one, the end of the Holocaust, which I'm happy to tell everyone that my husband translated into Hebrew. In recent years, he had written extensively about contemporary anti-Semitism, including the edited volume Resurgent Anti-Semitism. Again, some of us sitting here have papers in it, and we're very glad to be partners to this endeavor. So, Alvin, please.
Thank you, Dina. And Charles, I'd like to add my thank you to that already by so many others here. And not just a thank you, but a tribute to you for organizing this very substantial conference. But prior to this conference, no end of important work. And we hope that following this conference, we'll be able to look to you for continued leadership and more and more and more. And now to my paper, What Precisely is Criticism of Israel? And criticism of Israel will appear in quotation marks for reasons that you'll understand once I present these. Can you hear me, or does my voice carry okay?
Yeah,
good.
Okay.
Judith Butler opens Parting Ways, her critique of Zionism, by stating that she set out to write this book in order, and these are her words, to debunk the claim that any and all criticism of the State of Israel is effectively anti-Semitic. On first encounter, the statement astonishes, for no serious person claims that any and all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, so what is Butler up to? For those of us acquainted with contemporary anti-Zionist discourse, Butler's words are familiar and have been used countless times by others. Ben referred to them in his paper yesterday. What are they all about? They're meant to gain instant victim status for the speaker by claiming that anyone who dares to dissent from what is alleged to be the party line on Israel is sure to be denounced as an anti-Semite and thereby instantly silenced. Formulaic in character, these words are a recognizable trope within a new political rhetorical genre that calls itself criticism of Israel. And that's the argument that I want to develop in this paper today, that criticism of Israel doesn't resemble normative criticism of other countries and cultures, but is a literary political genre still underway, still developing, but already far enough along for us to be able to identify a number of its characteristic features. It doesn't resemble other modes of cultural or political criticism, but has its own peculiar logic, identifiable vocabulary, narrative conventions, and predictable outcomes. My paper will aim to expose this discourse for what I believe it is, not an expression of normative criticism, but a new and potent strain of rhetorical hostility focused on the Jewish state and its supporters. Permit me to begin by way of personal example, and I'll then broaden out to other sources. In December of 2006, I published an essay entitled Progressive Jewish Thought and the New Anti-Semitism. It slumbered for a while and then suddenly provoked the interests and passions of more people than I ever could have imagined. What accounted for that? The New York Times. The New York Times ran a prominent story about my work with the headline, "Essay Linking Liberal Jews to Anti-Semitism Sparks a Furor." In fact, prior to the Times article, there had been no furor. But in no time at all following this article, an article about an alleged attack on liberal Jews by a Jewish professor sitting somewhere in the Midwest, following this, the notion raced around the globe and in no time at all unleashed a huge and bitter debate. In part, the debate was triggered by the Times' erroneous reference to liberal Jews, a term I never once used in the article. Owing to this mischaracterization, some readers were prepared to see my essay as just the latest salvo in the already overheated culture wars between right-wing and left-wing opinion in America. Before reading what I actually wrote, for instance, Gershom Gorenberg groaned, and I quote him, "Here we go again. I thought another right-wing American Jew is trashing liberal Jews for voicing criticisms milder than what an Israeli ex-paratroop officer might express over lunch." On closer look, though, he found something quite different. A critical review, and these are his words, of those Jews who reject the very existence of a Jewish state and who express their opposition in shrieks that rise to equating Israel with the Nazis, and that's another feature of criticism of Israel, this analogy. Adopting their own self-chosen moniker, I took progressive, not liberal, as my term of choice. No commonly agreed upon taxonomy of terms, liberal, leftist, radical, exists to define progressive today with any precision, but the word generally is taken to designate a political position somewhere to the left of liberal. According to Andrei Markovits, a political scientist at the University of Michigan, an uncompromising anti-Zionism, which occasionally borders on the anti-Semitic, has become requisite for memberships in good standing in the progressive left. Together with anti-Americanism, anti-Zionism has become a kind of litmus test for progressive thinking and identity. Now, there are lots of people within the progressive left who strongly oppose these tendencies. Among others on the left, though, and often strident anti-Zionism is part of the ideological package that gives them their political identity. Their inclination to liken Israel to Nazi Germany and white-ruled South Africa, and their frequent excoriations of the Jewish state as guilty of racism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and genocide, draw from a common lexicon of hyperbolically corrosive speech. These terms are constantly recycled through this genre criticism of Israel, and they establish the strident tone of what we can see as a still developing and distinctively polemical literary political genre. Citing innumerable examples of such tendentious thinking, I closed my essay by noting that at a time when the delegitimization and ultimately the eradication of Israel is a goal being voiced with mounting fervor by the enemies of the Jewish state, it's more than disheartening to see Jews themselves adding to the vilification. Many readers wrote me and agreed with these conclusions, but some were clearly discombobulated. I'm almost in a state of shock, Alan Wolf, a professor at Boston College, wrote in the New York Times. Confronting me on a very popular NPR radio program, he continued by accusing me of employing what he called Stalinist tactics to stifle free speech and suppress open debate. Michael Lerner, editor of the journal Tikkun, told the International Herald Tribune, and I quote him, "The atmosphere has become hysterical, verging on McCarthyism. You can't raise questions about Israel without being told you're an anti-Semite or a self-hating and disloyal Jew." The Boston Globe ran a story under the absurd heading, "All critics of Israel aren't anti-Semites." It carries the fantastic charge that my real targets were Democrats and opponents of George Bush's dubious adventure into Iraq. Writing in the New York Review of Books, a very influential journal, as you know, George Soros, no less, denounced my essay as an instrument of a pro-Israel lobby and an insidious means of stifling debate. I had never before been criticized by a billionaire, but there you have it. And the Jewish newspaper, The Forward, lost its editorial wits altogether in featuring a piece headed "Infamy," claiming that my intent was to turn Jews against liberalism and silence critics, and for these alleged sins they placed me in their secular version of Cherem. Since I never once referred to liberalism, check the article and you'll see the word doesn't appear. Never once called anyone a Jewish anti-Semite or a self-hating Jew, said nothing about Democrats or the Iraq War, made no attempts to silence anyone, this Kafkaesque bill of indictments made me wonder what in the world was going on here. How, after all, does joining a debate become an effort to suppress a debate? Dunno. Vigorous discussion of Israeli policies and actions is not in dispute. Such discussion proceeds across all of the media of communication in the United States, and even more so within Israel itself. It's disingenuous, therefore, to say that you can't raise questions about Israel. Such questions are raised continually by a broad range of commentators. The ubiquitous rubric criticism of Israel, however, designates another kind of discourse. Those who think and write within the terms of this genre are typically less interested in critically examining particular Israeli policies and actions than in questioning the very idea of a Jewish state and its right to a future. Its establishment, they contend, was a mistake, its continuation an act of injustice against the indigenous people of the land, and its exclusivist, militaristic character at serious odds with the ethical traditions of Judaism itself. All of these are claimed by practitioners of this genre. At the ideational core of what passes as criticism, one finds what the British scholar Bernard Harrison has called a dialectical scam. It goes something like this. Spot an Israeli action that might serve as the ground of criticism of Israel. He gives the example of Israel's military incursion into the area near Jenin in April 2002 in response to Palestinian terrorist massacres. Then dissent from Israel in the strongest possible terms, for instance, by likening what the dissenters denounced as the Nazi-like razing of Jenin to the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto. And then, when taken to task by more sober-minded observers who find that, contrary to these charges, there never was such a thing as the razing of Jenin, and that the IDF had nothing in common with the SS, then cry foul and claim that censure of this kind perfectly illustrates the point that there really must be some Jewish organizational conspiracy to silence criticism of Israel by branding the authors of such criticism anti-Semites. For some, this dialectical scam works nicely and validates their sense of themselves as intellectual martyrs suffering for a higher ideological cause. Once one is on to what they are doing, however, the scam readily dissolves into what it really is, an expression of political bias, often compounded by a touch of hysteria, masquerading as victimization. Seen in these terms, criticism of Israel lacks persuasive arguments and is empty at its core. Nevertheless, it needs to be taken seriously for the reasons that Dina just mentioned, namely, in certain circles it has strong appeal and it can provoke damaging political action against the state. A prominent example is the rapid growth of the BDS campaign on American campuses. Since Tammy Rossman Benjamin will be speaking about that in detail, I'll skirt the BDS material in this paper and instead draw your attention to a journal called the Journal of Academic Freedom, a respectable journal put out by the Association of American University Professors, which a couple of years ago published a number of essays that presented grounds for the boycotts that were to come. In making their charges against Israel, every one of these essays, resolutions and position papers, employed more or less the same language, all of it condemnatory. I don't have time to cite more than one or two examples. One comes from a very prominent scholar, Joan Scott, of Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, herself a Jew, by the way, who claims, and I quote her, that the Israeli state regularly denies academic freedom to critics of the state, and that its Council for Higher Education conducts inquisitions among university faculty seeking to harass, demote, or fire dissidents. She offers not a single example as evidence of such repressive measures. As one of her critics remarks, asserting something is not the same thing as substantiating it. But Scott, an otherwise good scholar in her own field, sets aside such academic niceties as the presentation of corroborating proof, and she rests her case entirely on vilifying statements. So do others in the BDS movement. One, Bill Mullen, a professor at Purdue University, also a contributor to the journal I mentioned, says that Israel's sins, in fact, began with the establishment of the state itself, and I quote him, "The creation of the state of Israel in 48, on land home to generations of Arab Palestinians, is the contemporary world's most egregious instance of settler colonialism." Whether he ever heard of Tibet and China, who knows, but it's not to be found here. He continues, "Israeli crimes of racial discrimination and segregation against the Palestinian citizens of Israel resemble the defunct apartheid system in South Africa." Again, not a single piece of evidence is given. As extreme as this denunciatory rhetoric is, though, it gets worse. Curtis Marez, who was president of the American Studies Association at the time of that organization's boycott resolution, was a signatory to a letter to President Obama accusing Israel of pursuing, and I quote from this letter, "an insidious policy of extermination so merciless in its character and extent as to constitute one of the most massive ethnocidal atrocities of modern times." Although the charge is groundless, the letter that contains it, which labels Israel a racist state, an apartheid state, and a criminal regime, was signed by more than 900 academic scholars. The language I've been citing, full of familiar buzzwords and political cliches about Israeli racism, colonialism, ethnic cleansing, and the like, is now standard fare in progressive academic circles. To brand Israel as today's leading, indeed only exemplar of state-sponsored criminality, apartheid South Africa, is constantly cited. So too is Nazi Germany. Omar Barghouti, the founder of the BDS movement, declares, and I quote him, that some of Israel's racist and sadistic actions against the Palestinians are reminiscent of common Nazi practices against the Jews. Those are his words, not mine. The charge is damning, but no more so than similar charges made by numerous others today. To quote just one, very local one, writing in Haaretz in March of this year, the Hebrew University historian Daniel Blattman declares, and I quote him, that a racist cancer has spread deep into Israeli society, and Israel is sliding toward an apartheid regime. In the eyes of many, he is certain, and again these are his words, Israel no longer has a place in the family of enlightened nations. It has become the South Africa of the 21st century. Evident here is an extreme form of verbal violence directed against an Israel being transfigured into a monster state. The French linguist Georges Elias Sarfati offers a perceptive analysis of the character and appeal of this rhetoric, and I quote him. A number of key equations dominate anti-Zionist discourse. The master one is Zionism equals Nazism. The second one derives from the first, Zionism equals racism. A third is Zionism is colonialism. A fourth is Zionism is imperialism. What do we have here? These four distinct equations can be synthesized into one, the Zionist, fascist, racist, and colonialist state. These equivalencies are so evil because they attach the four major negative characteristics of Western history in the last century: Nazism, racism, colonialism, and imperialism, to the State of Israel. If one tries to summarize this, the conclusion that Sarfati reaches is this: the less Israel, the more peace. Many of you live here. You know that, like all countries, Israel has its shortcomings. But nothing this country has done, as far as I can tell, warrants putting it in the company of Verwoerd, South Africa, or Hitler's Germany. With the growing normalization of anti-Zionist discourse, though, that is just where the country now finds itself. Deeply embedded in the minds and speech acts of numbers of people, anti-Zionism has become both a cultural given and a social expectation in some circles. Linked by its advocates to anti-racism, anti-Zionism finds sanction through invocations of the Holocaust repeatedly. The anti-Zionism that has been emerging in recent years usually has little or nothing to do with Zionism itself. To understand it, one needs to put the stress on the anti that precedes the hyphen rather than the Zionism that follows it. For what distinguishes anti-Zionism more than anything else is the negative passions it embodies. Through the frequent repetition of a limited but emotionally charged lexicon of defamatory terms, anti-Zionism has developed a language of its own, conveying in strongly felt terms a now familiar litany of accusations and indictments directed at the State of Israel. The truth content of these charges is taken to be self-evident, and in the minds of those who make them, their substance stands in no need of verification. And so Joan Scott feels free to assert, again without offering any evidence, I quote her, that Israeli children are regularly taught that Arab lives are worth less than Jewish lives. Omar Barghouti states with equal certainty, and again without evidence of any kind, that most Israelis view Palestinians as less than human, and that sharpshooter Israeli soldiers are guilty of hunting Palestinian children, enticing them like mice into playing football, and then shooting them with silencers. I'm not making that up. That's all quoted from Barghouti. Inflammatory statements of this kind, now commonly voiced, are illustrative of what Sarfati has called a pornographic dimension of the new anti-Semitism. The speakers, listeners, and those who watch all enjoy it. At its most extreme, anti-Semitic discourse may show parallels to pornography. It's worth exploring. The more one indulges in such fantasy-laden rhetoric, the more habit-forming it becomes. The fact that it's a bad habit is beside the point, for the people addicted to it are lured by its appeal and will continue to pursue it. Mm-hmm. My friend Dina is saying enough. The only thing I'll add, if I had had a bit more time, is that in addition to what may be, and I want to be tentative because I'm not sure he's right, but what may be this pornographic dimension, Elchanan Yakira has been developing the notion of what he calls virtuous anti-Semitism, and it's often the case that people who voice this language pride themselves on being far taller than the rest of us. Yes. Thank you.
There was a movie being done, Jenin Jenin, as you know, and soldiers who fought in Jenin, and 13 of them were killed because the place was not to be bombed, because it is a place with civilians, and lost 13 of their friends and comrades, tried to sue the producer of the movie, Mohammed Bakri, so that it is censored, because it does not tell the truth, it's a lie. But our Supreme Court, headed at that time, led at that time by Dalia Dorner, Supreme Court Judge Dalia Dorner, decided that it's a case of freedom of speech, and the movie went on telling what it told. Well, I was about to say that I'm very happy to invite Professor Erwin Kotler, but then thinking about all that we are hearing in this conference, I'm not sure that I'm that happy. Our friend, Professor Erwin Kotler, has a long line of titles, as you know. He's a member of the Canadian Parliament, Emeritus Professor of Law at McGill University, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and a leading voice in the struggle for human rights in Canada and internationally. Professor Kotler is a recipient of numerous awards for his work in peace and human rights advocacy, including 11 honorary doctorates and an officer of the Order of Canada. In Parliament, he is Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights and Human Rights and International Justice critic for the Liberal Party. He is co-founder and served as International Chair of the Interparliamentary Coalition to Combat Anti-Semitism, and he will be speaking about the laundering of delegitimation under the cover of universal values. I warned you.
Thank you, Dina, and I want to join Alvin Rosenfeld in paying our shared tribute to you for all your initiatives over the years. And I also want to recognize Professor Yehuda Bauer, who really has been a mentor to so many of us and one of the founding fathers in the field of both anti-Semitism and Holocaust studies. Kol hakavod. Delegitimization, which is a kind of organizing theme of this panel, has become a buzzword of discourse to denote, among other things, the assault on Israel's legitimacy, if not also its right to exist, let alone the kind of indictments of Israel that we have heard from the former speakers. And it has spawned a veritable industry, a veritable conference industry on this topic. And it has become even a central theme of foreign policy. The Israeli government has identified delegitimization as one of three major strategic threats. A year ago, Vice President Biden in the United States devoted almost all of his talk at the annual AIPAC meeting to this strategic threat of delegitimization. This was then followed, of course, later on in the course of the peace process, where Secretary of State Kerry warned against the delegitimization that would emerge if the peace process were to break down. So I'm only making that point. I'm not taking positions on those issues, only to say that it is not only a buzzword of intellectual discourse and academic discourse, it has now entered into the lexicon of foreign policy. But the theme of my remarks today is that the real issue is not just the notion of delegitimization. The real issue is what I would call the laundering of that delegitimization under all the universal public values. In other words, the laundering of that delegitimization, for example, and I'll get to it, under the protective cover of the United Nations, under the authority of international law, under the culture of human rights, under the struggle against racism, under the struggle against genocide and other mass atrocities. In other words, it's this laundering of delegitimization under the public values that then gives it a form of legitimation in the public discourse and in the foreign policy encounters. Simply put, if war is the continuation of politics by other means, as Clausewitz put it, then lawfare, the laundering of delegitimization, if you will, is the waging of war, the war of delegitimization under the cover of law. One caveat to my remarks, maybe I should have even given it in my opening remarks the first evening, and it is this. Nothing that I'm going to say in seeking to combat this laundering of delegitimization or in our involvement in the struggle against anti-Semitism, nothing that I'm going to say is intended to suggest that somehow, I know that this is something that we can take as a given here, but it is something that nonetheless needs to be said. Nothing that I'm going to say is intended to suggest that somehow Israel is above the law, or that Israel is not accountable for any violations of human rights and humanitarian law. On the contrary, Israel, like any other country, is accountable to the rule of law. And Israel and the Jewish people do not enjoy any privileged position before the law because of the history of anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, or other mass atrocities against Israel and the Jewish people. But the problem, I suggest to you, is not that Israel should seek, or that anyone should seek on Israel's behalf, that Israel be above the law. The problem is that Israel is being systematically denied equality before the law in the international arena. Not that Israel should respect human rights, which she must, but that the equal rights of Israel deserve equal respect. Not that Israel should adhere to international human rights standards, which we also would take as a normative requirement, but that the rest of the international community also has to be held to those universal standards. Now, no singling out of any member state of the international community for differential or discriminatory treatment, because that ends up being a denial of foundational principles of equality before the law, international due process, and the like. Now, a second underlying thesis of my remarks today is that despite all the attention that delegitimization is getting, delegitimization is not a new phenomenon. In other words, it was present at the creation of the state where Israel was spoken of as an original sin. It acted as a precursor to the Six-Day War. And I remember I was here as a student at the Hebrew University at the time during the Six-Day War, where Israel was spoken of as a congenital act of aggression. In other words, it was not what Israel did that was the problem, it was the fact that Israel existed. And then, of course, we have, and I referred to it in my opening remarks together, even the United Nations Zionism is Racism resolution in 1975, which the late Senator Daniel Moynihan, in giving expression to the dangers of a laundering of delegitimization, spoke of it as saying that it gave the abomination of anti-Semitism the appearance of international legal sanction. Moynihan becoming the first, in effect, to identify the phenomenon of the laundering of delegitimization. But no one would have appreciated then, because it was a Soviet initiative and a Soviet Arab initiative, and so it was more easily dismissed as not being part of the human rights culture. Interestingly enough, and this is another relevant point, is that the laundering of delegitimization emerged with, became coincident with, the emergence of the international human rights revolution. At the same time as the Zionism is Racism resolution. Israel and world Jewry were paying a lot of attention to the Zionism is Racism resolution, but very little attention to the emergence of the international human rights revolution. Although in one reference it did with regard to the Helsinki Final Act, but that as applied to the struggle for Soviet Jewry, itself one of the great human rights struggles of the second half of the 20th century. But what we were ignoring was what the late Congressman Father Robert Drinan, one of the early advocates in the struggle for Soviet Jewry, was saying at the time, in the late 70s, that the elevation of human rights into an international juridical norm was the most dramatic development in the history of contemporary jurisprudence, as he put it. As a law professor and human rights lawyer at the time, in the 70s, I found myself witness to, and this really underpins much of my remarks, the experiential involvement in these struggles, not just the scholarly appreciation of what was going on. I found myself witness to and involved with two parallel and intersecting universes. One was the universe of human rights and the legal revolution which was attending it, which underpinned the struggle for Soviet Jewry at the time. We forget that the struggle for Soviet Jewry, in fact, invoked much of the beginnings of the global human rights revolution on its behalf. But at the same time, we were ignoring what was the developing obverse side of this legal human rights revolution, and that was the use and abuse of law, the United Nations, human rights, the struggle against racism being invoked for delegitimization purposes. At the same time, and again, parenthetically, this should not cause us, that which happened and that which continues to be happening in intensified form, to somehow retreat from the struggle for human rights or the culture for human rights, or in turn to demonize the whole notion of human rights simply because that notion, in its form of lawfare in itself, has been used to underpin the laundering of delegitimization. Because if we do that, then as the French put it, that those who are absent, les absents sont toujours retardés. If you're absent, then you won't be there to be able to make a difference at a time when one needs to be part of it. Indeed, a case study of the convergence of these two universes, of the human rights revolution on the one hand, and delegitimization or the laundering of delegitimization under the cover of that human rights and legal revolution on the other, went largely unnoticed, even though it was occurring at the same time as the Zionism is racism resolution. Simply put, a critical mass of delegitimization of lawfare, of the laundering of delegitimization under all the universal values, public values, under the protective cover, for example, international law, human rights, the United Nations, was proceeding under the radar screen, but was really at the forefront of what was to become the laundering of delegitimization. And so I'm going to use a case study from the United Nations specialized agencies at the time. In 1975, I was struck by the fact that while this was going on, at the same time as the Zionism racism resolution was going on, everyone knew about the Zionism as racism resolution. We were able to dismiss it as a Soviet, Arab bloc plot, but nobody was paying attention to this much more serious and initially beginning sustained laundering of delegitimization. Let me just give you a kind of abstract from it. And so it was that Israel was held out to be the enemy of trade unionism. Evidence, the resolution, and I can say evidence, you can say alleged evidence, but this is how it was, because all these resolutions to which I'm referring passed then and have continued to be passed since. Okay, so we're talking now not as a phenomenon that developed yesterday or last year, but a 40-year-old phenomenon of laundering of delegitimization and the cumulative effect over time that leads to the kinds of situations described by Alvin and described in our presentations that have taken place thus far. The enemy of trade unionism. Evidence, the resolution of the International Labour Organization condemning Israeli suppression of Palestinian workers. The enemy of health, Evidence, the resolution of the World Health Organization condemning Israeli poisoning of Palestinians on the West Bank. The enemy of culture. Evidence, the resolution of UNESCO condemning Israeli desecration of historic sites in Jerusalem. The enemy of women. Evidence, the resolution of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women condemning Israeli oppression of women. The enemy of human rights. Evidence, the resolution of the UN Human Rights Commission condemning Israeli violations of human rights. And the enemy of peace. Evidence, the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly condemning Israel as a non-peace-loving nation. In a word, Israel was held out to be, 40 years ago, and since, as the enemy of all that is good. Workers' rights, health, culture, women, human rights, and peace. And the repository, therefore, of all that is evil. The forerunner of the ultimate in delegitimization today, spoken of in Alvin's speech, the indictment of Israel, not only, if you will, as an apartheid or Nazi state of which I spoke of the other evening, but also adding to it, the four horses of evil in terms of imperialism and colonialism. And Israel therefore becomes not only the enemy of all that is good, as set forth in this laundering of delegitimization, but the repository of all that is evil. As I wrote 35 years ago, and indeed reaffirmed in my lecture the other evening, that in a world in which human rights has emerged as the new secular religion of our time, something which I celebrated at the time, and I want to add, still do, because I stand with the emergence of that human rights revolution. By the way, the Jewish people were at the forefront of the emergence of that revolution. I can go back and even mention all those who were there at the beginning, like René Cassin, etc., or our involvement in the establishment of the whole UN human rights system. But leave that aside for now. But in a world in which human rights has emerged as a new secular religion of our time, Israel was being held out as a meta-human rights violator, as a new geopolitical antichrist of our time. And so the question, which you could have already been asking yourself, now comes to the fore. If delegitimization has always been with us, why is it only in the last few years that it has become a byword and buzzword of academic discourse and foreign policy? What has changed? Is it simply a matter of plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose? How does this impact not only in terms of how we think about human rights and about Israel in the international arena, but no less important, on how we act? I'm going to organize the balance of my remarks on two themes. The first, the cluster of dynamics that have underpinned this developing critical mass of delegitimization. How we got to where we are from when it began in that dramatic case study I gave you of all those resolutions 40 years ago of UN specialized agencies. And then second, 4 case studies of the manner in which delegitimization is laundered under the public values. Let me begin with the cluster of dynamics which provide context and content for the phenomenon of the laundering of delegitimization. The first is, and these dynamics are not necessarily in and of themselves negative. Many of them are positive. I'm saying it's the manner in which these become invoked and then abused and then laundering the question of delegitimization. The first is globalization, not only of media and markets, of technology and trade, but the globalization of law, of human rights, of NGOs, of the emergence of transnational actors in the struggle for human rights, of the constituents of the international legal revolution, of lawfare, if I can use that term, in the best sense of the word. We shouldn't only look at lawfare as being in and of itself a negative connotation. It is the manner in which all this has been used which makes it negative. The phenomenon of lawfare in terms of the struggle for human rights, in terms of the international legal revolution, is in and of itself a good thing, as I mentioned. But at the same time, there is this obverse and darker side of the international legal revolution, lawfare underpinning delegitimization and emerging also as a global phenomenon. The second is the reconfiguration that occurred also around the early 70s. The reconfiguration of the Arab-Israeli conflict as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As my colleague Justice Walter Tarnopolsky said to me in 1976, coincident at the time with the international human rights revolution, he was a great human rights scholar, said to me at the time that so long as the Arabs deny Israel's right to exist, they have no case and no standing to make the case. But if Israel begins to be perceived as denying the Palestinians their right to self-determination, they will be perceived as not only having no case, but no standing to make their case. It was a rather prescient comment at the time, but it was within the framework, as I say, of the reconfiguration of the Arab-Israeli conflict as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The third was the reframing of the narrative of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in human rights terms, and the Palestinization of that narrative. Frankly, I credit, on a strategic level, I credit the Palestinians and theirs who seized the moment of the international human rights revolution to, in effect, Palestinize the Palestinian narrative with a human rights narrative. And so you had the Palestinization of the human rights narrative as part and parcel of the emergence of the Palestinian cause, which was held out as the prototypical human rights cause, while Israel and world Jewry were speaking about Soviet Jewry as a prototypical human rights cause, which it was, but ignoring what was also going on, which was the emergence of the Palestinian case, not now, then, 40 years ago, as a human rights case. And the corollary, of course, which was also being ignored by Israel and much of world Jewry, was Israel's emergence as the antithesis of that cause and of the developing that way, the cause of human rights generally. Not justifying that happening, I'm just trying to describe the dynamics that we're developing. The fourth was the mainstreaming of the human rights narrative and the Palestinization of that narrative amongst the elites, political, diplomatic, parliamentary, media, NGOs, and intellectuals. Ilan Pappé is not I don't think a person that needs to be a matter of concern, though a matter that has to be made aware of. It's the support system that was given to the Ilan Pappé by those who might be called la trahison des clercs, as Benda put it, the treason of the intellectuals. That is what gives the kind of delegitimization that Alvin referred to and others, a certain succor and assistance, precisely because it anchors itself in this human rights culture. Fifth, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement as metaphor and message of delegitimization in the politicization of academe and the Palestinization of the campus culture, with the Palestinian cause becoming the poster child for the human rights cause in the campus culture. Again, we were missing the fact that the campus culture in which I was living and working as a law professor at the time was being transformed rightly into a human rights culture. And that is where a lot of the movements were being spawned, movements for women's rights, movements for the environment, and so on. And along with it, to their credit in a strategic sense, was the Palestinization of human rights and the development thereafter of Israeli Apartheid Week as an adjunct to this phenomenon. Sixth was the end of the Cold War and the denouement of the struggle for Soviet Jewry. That occupied Israel and world Jewry rightly for the better part of 25, 30 years. It also meant that we were not part of the other developing dynamic that was going on in terms of the human rights revolution, Palestinization of it, and the like. Finally came Durban and its aftermath. Durban was not the place where the delegitimization movement began. Durban was the place where the delegitimization movement was codified. And those and I was there in Durban, some of us were there, and it was done not by governments, it was done by NGOs. And what is forgotten is that the Israeli leadership came back from Durban and credited themselves as having had a victory at Durban because the intergovernmental document that emerged made no reference to this culture of delegitimization. But the NGO document which emerged with its anchorage in boycott, divestment, sanctions, reference to Israel apartheid and the like, that did have a manifestation of the laundering of delegitimization, which regrettably was sometimes being too oft ignored. And so, as I said, the battle cry in Durban, which we didn't pay attention to at the time, the refrain in the streets was, if the struggle against racism in the 20th century required the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state, then the struggle against racism in the 21st century requires the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. And so the transformation of that struggle against racism from the struggle against apartheid, another great human rights struggle of the second half of the 20th century, along with Soviet Jewry, into the particular delegitimization of Israel. So the phenomenon of delegitimization and the laundering of delegitimization under all the good rubrics paralleled, as I said, the emergence of the human rights and legal revolution. I was going to give 4 case studies of it. I'm going to take 3 and 1 minute, if I may, on just each one of them. The first is the launching of delegitimization under the protective cover of the United Nations. We know, for example, and it's no secret, that every year at the UN General Assembly, some 20 to 22 resolutions are passed against one member state of the international community. It happens to be Israel. More resolutions than are passed against the rest of the international community combined. But that is not the only problem. As somebody who is there, and as a member of the Canadian delegation, I can tell you, the real issue is, if you think about it, this process goes on for 3 months every year, September through December, mid-September. And so every delegation has, as members of it, parliamentarians, academics, jurists, church leaders, journalists, students, and the like. All these are exposed to this critical mass of delegitimization and have been so exposed for 40 years. So there's a critical mass of the internalization of this delegitimization going on without us appreciating it's not simply a question of just anti-Jewishness. It's that people come there as a tabula rasa. They come there uninformed and over time become misinformed and over time become the agents of delegitimization, while we are dismissing the UN, whether shmoom, not realizing the importance of this dynamic. And one other thing on the UN that's important. One of the organizing rubrics of delegitimization at the United Nations has been the increasing reference to the illegality of the Israeli settlements. Not taking a position here on that point other than to say this, that law is a very important component. Like, in other words, United States, Canada, Europe is a legal culture. If you say that something is illegal, it's much more important that you say something is stupid or ill-advised or a wrong policy. If you continue to repeat over time and you have judgments of the UN that read like legal judgments, findings of fact, conclusions of law, year after year, in the UN General Assembly and a specialized agency regarding the illegality of the Israeli settlements, people begin to internalize a notion of Israel as an outlaw in the international community. That's how the notion of settlements has to be seen in terms of its intellectual and legal follow. On the matter of delegitimization and authority of international law, just one example. You know, we are meeting today on the 10th anniversary of the International Court of Justice opinion regarding the illegality of the security fence. You know that yesterday, and I was reminded because yesterday the Pope was brought to by the Palestinians in a sophisticated maneuver in a certain sense, because what the Pope was advised of was that this was the 10th anniversary, and therefore, you should pay homage not to the fence so much, but to international law, to the judgment of the International Court of Justice on the illegality of the Israelis. Again, the laundering under all the rubrics. Under the matter of the delegitimization under the culture of human rights, and I will close with this. Let me just say that the UN Human Rights Council, which has passed more resolutions against Israel, again, than all the other countries combined, and it's easy, let's say, to dismiss the UN Council on Human Rights because of its, perfidious behavior and the like. But I can.
And the members, it's Iran, it's Syria.
Yes, but you go into law schools, and the jurisprudence of the UN Council on Human Rights is being taught by law professors in law schools, and we're missing this point that this is part of the culture of the laundering of the legitimization, and then we may wonder why do these law students who come out then join boycott, divestment, signing. It's all part, as I say, of a very sophisticated laundering of delegitimization. And so I will close just by saying, because I have certain strategies as to how to combat it, but I'll just mention very quickly. The first thing is very important for those who care about this struggle or involved in this, to understand that one has to get out of the docket of the defendant, or seeing oneself only as a defendant, and begin to see oneself as a human rights claimant. Which brings me to the second point. Delegitimization should not be held out or framed only as a threat to Israel and the Jewish people. Because if we continue to do that, frankly, most of the people don't go to bed at night, most non-Jews don't go to bed at night worried about delegitimization. They may not have even heard that, which is such a common word of discourse. I speak to my non-Jewish parliamentarians and talk to them about delegitimization. I mean, it's not something that with which they're engaged. But they can become engaged if you say to them, look, this is not just a threat to Israel and the Jewish people. Yes, it's that. But it's a threat to all the things you care about. It's a threat to the United Nations and what it is purported to stand for, equality before the law, etc. It's a threat to the whole authority of international law when delegitimization is laundered under its rubric. It's a threat to the whole culture of human rights that we want to embrace. It's a threat to international peace and security, and so on. That's the way this has to be held out. And in order to do that, we ourselves have got to get engaged in this struggle for human rights as a whole, lest we be seen to be only special pleaders for one cause. Engaged in the human rights struggle as a whole, and then we will have more effective standing to also engage in the struggle against the laundering of delegitimization under the cover of human rights. Thank you.
I thought we all deserve a coffee after this session, but Robert says a few minutes of debate. So, Weizmir, זה לא ילך. This won't be a few minutes, but I'd like to emphasize that a question is a question and not a lecture that begins with Abraham, our forefather. Okay? Please.
I was both very impressed and very moved by the presentation by Viewing Koffer. I think he made a great point in saying that we had a period when it was the Soviet Arab bloc that was dictating lots of things. My personal opinion is that the entire human rights problem now, the entire human rights doctrine is crumbling because we don't denounce the fact that a large numbers of countries and NGOs that are part of the international community today either do not exist as countries. What is Somalia or Libya doing in international organizations today, since they do not exist as states, as governments? And second, many of these countries are simply not observing, not keeping the human rights as they should. They should be discarded from the debate. I mean, what I say, I understand what I say is quite far-reaching, but if we miss that point, we're not going to go nowhere.
Okay, thank you. Please.
Just a question to Professor Yakira. Does the Israeli establishment realize that it represents a people of 6 to 7 million Jews living on a very small territory, which is surrounded by continents which are at war against it? Because it looks from your presentation that the Israeli public is not aware of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, but maybe I am making a mistake. The second question is, do you realize that the new anti-Semitism is presented exactly in the same rational discourse that you express, that you describe of the anti-Zionist Israeli, which is without hatred and just rationalized the arguments for Israel to be destroyed, and that he rationalized the reason to commit suicide by himself, because he's evil, by two questions.
Robert says one last question because there are at least 10 others. Ben, bevakasha. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Very quickly, to Professor Yakira, I was puzzled when you talked about Udi Adiv and the Red Front. Why didn't you mention that they went to Syria, that they went to Baathist Syria?
Well, the story is known.
Well, no, but there's a significance there that they went to basically a fascist state that was oppressing its Jews. From that, I want to extrapolate to bring in the other speakers. Should therefore, if we take the Red Front case as somehow emblematic, should we not really be talking, instead of a human rights culture, of an anti-human rights culture?
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry about all the others because we could have continued for long. Please, answers?
Yeah, we have to be... Well, I think that... I don't know about the Israeli establishment and what they know and don't, and how do they think and understand the global. I can only say I think the Israeli public in general, especially Israeli-born people, are much less sensitive and worried about anti-Semitism than I think Jews living outside of Israel. For most of us, anti-Semitism is a kind of rumor. We never experienced it, and I think what worries us here mainly is what's going on here. Of course, we are aware that we are a small country surrounded by enemies, etc., etc., etc. But you know, Giora Eilert, he was a general in the army, and he's very critical in many ways of many things that happen here, and he's very aware of all the dangers and threats and challenges. And he was the other day talking on radio, television. He counted all the problems and menaces, but at the end he said, you know what? We are doing not so bad. And actually Israel does not so bad. It's the situation, if you look around Israel, what happened in Syria, and what happened there, and what happened even in Egypt, that they're not doing that bad. And there are many problems and many threats, and this is one. Now, Udi Adiv, I don't want to defend Udi Adiv, of course not. He was a traitor, no question about it. But I think that his case, and especially this guy who was my friend, and I know him quite well, and I really liked him a lot, was an extraordinary guy. He still is, I guess. I think this can serve as a paradigm to understand the phenomenon, because Udi Adiv is the group of people around him is the extreme manifestation of something which exists even without going this far. And what I wanted to say that this is something different from what we usually describe with the term of self-hatred. There was no hatred there, and there was certainly not self-hatred there. Just one last sentence. Some years ago, I was, we were, Alvin was there too, in the, also kind of a workshop on anti-Semitism in the Holocaust Museum in Holocaust Museum in Washington, and I talked about something quite similar to what I'm talking today, and I made a presentation of a clip from YouTube of another Israeli pilot, Jonathan Shapira, you know, who had this pathetic little show near the
security wall.
Yeah, the ghetto walls, the Warsaw ghetto was saying that all ghettos should be, the Gaza ghetto should be freed like the Warsaw ghetto, and there was scandals that, you know, but if you look at this guy, I mean, if there is anything that can be talked about in psychological terms, it's Marxism, and not anything that is hate. And I think that in order to understand the phenomenon, and there is a phenomenon here, of what we use and refer by the term of betrayal sometimes, we have to try to really look at the things that they are and understand it. I think that one of the things I want to say is nothing to do with this,
Yeah.
especially
Okay.
with self.
Thank you. Alvin, please.
Then you asked the question, should we oppose anti-human rights cultures?
As opposed to human rights culture, talk
Sure.
about anti-human rights.
Yes, and the answer is obvious, we should. And the more of us who do, and the more effective we do, the better. We're living in trying times. There have been worse times, but the challenges are serious challenges, and one of them is posed by those very forces that you're identifying. So to the degree we can help expose them, and thereby maybe weaken their hold, sure.
Yeah, to both of you, Michelle, and absolutely, the human rights violators not only diminish the human rights culture, they expose, you know, the hypocrisy that has become part of the human rights culture. When you have human rights violators sitting on the UN Human Rights Council in judgment, and thereby ignoring all the rights of the victims, we should be taking this cause up as part of UN reform, as part of speaking on behalf of the victims who are victimized by these human rights violators. Not turn it into an Israeli issue, turn it into a larger human rights issue, where we become the advocates for the larger human rights cause on behalf of the real victims. Hillel Neuer does that at his annual summit on human rights and democracy in Geneva. And when he brings together former prisoners of conscience, former dissidents, and all, the real victims of human rights violations by the violators sitting on the council. Expose that, unmask that, but do it in the name of the real, authentic struggle for human rights. You mentioned Libya, Michel. I wouldn't talk about Libya in terms of Israel, the Middle East, and the like. You have a French journalist for Le Monde who wrote a brilliant piece on sexual violence against women in armed conflict using Libya as a case study. That's where we should be. We should be engaged in the whole question of fighting against violence against women, sexual violence against women in armed conflict. Another part of the human rights struggle. Take Iran. I think if you want to make the case for Iran, I found if I go to campuses, if I start to talk to them about the nuclear issue, they start to roll their eyes, etc. But if I talk to them about the human rights violations by the Iranian regime against their own people, about the critical mass of violations of human rights in Iran, about the fact that under Rouhani, during his charm offensive, the per capita rate of executions, which before Rouhani was already the largest in the world, has actually increased under Rouhani to expose, therefore, the hypocrisy of the charm offensive, but to do it under the rubric of human rights. And after I go through a whole series of critical mass violations of human rights of the Iranian people by the Rouhani regime, then they're prepared to listen. Do you want this country to have a nuclear bomb? Do you want this, etc., etc.? So I think we can take the culture of human rights. The UN is not going to go away. International law is not going to go away. Human rights is not going to go away. And start to be engaged in it and turn it to our advantage, and not in terms of the configuration of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but in the larger struggle for human rights as a whole, and it will have fallout which will benefit us with regard to the Israeli-Arab conflict. One just last point from even our own Jewish values. Talk a lot about the responsibility to protect. That's emerged as an important normative doctrine. 192 nations adopted it in the UN in 2005. Of course, we make a mockery of it in terms of what's happening in Syria and no intervention. I can go on, all this as you know about. But what about us? Going back to our own roots, Lo Tamod Al Dam Re'acha. Where does the responsibility to protect doctrine come? It comes right out of our own tradition.
But this is not a human rights revolution, but at best a human rights aspiration. And this is your mistake. When you are presented it as a human rights revolution.
Absolutely a human rights revolution.
We cannot.
Emergence of
when more than half of the world is not with it, it's not a human rights revolution.
No, I talked about the enactment.
Yeah, what in your presentation? I'm referring to your presentation.
Yeah, we cannot have a mistake at the end of the session. That should have been at the beginning.
When I say a human rights revolution, I am talking about it as a law professor or legal scholar, human rights. I'm saying this gives us the tools. We should be happy about the universal
But you are beating yourself using the term revolution, which is not a fact at all. It's a trend, it's an aspiration, it's not a revolution. And you are playing with them.
I'm not playing with them.
Yes, you are playing because you are thinking that it is a revolution. It's not a revolution. It's an aspiration. It's not yet a revolution.
Let me just tell you one thing, and I want to close on it, because I think this is an important point. You know, if we get involved on the fight of whether it is or is not a revolution, then we're losing sight. Call it an aspiration, I don't care. But we're losing sight of our importance of being involved in that struggle for human rights. I'm only saying a revolution in a sense, these are not my words, but all the scholars will tell you that the adoption of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, these are not aspirations, these are part of the corpus of customary international law. That's what's being abused, not aspirations. We should say we have to go back to both the law and the aspirations and be part of that. If you don't want to call it revolution, don't call it. I'm just saying the struggle for human rights.
Okay.